Welcome to Sinister Media, where we explore the dark corners of history. Today, we're boarding a journey through tragedy as we examine 4 horrific train accidents that sent shockwaves across America in 1987. Fasten your seatbelts as we uncover the stories behind these devastating railway disasters that changed the face of rail safety forever.
The bitter cold of January 4, 1987, bore witness to a tragedy that would forever scar the annals of American railway history. As the sun struggled to pierce through the hazy winter sky, an insidious chain of events was already in motion, set to converge in a perfect storm of human error, mechanical failure, and cruel fate. In the quaint town of Chase, Maryland, life moved at its usual languid pace. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels on tracks was a familiar backdrop to the everyday hustle and bustle. Little did the townsfolk know that on this day, that comforting sound would transform into a cacophony of terror. The Colonial, Amtrak's pride, thundered down the tracks with unwavering determination. Its sleek silver body gleamed under the weak winter sun, a beacon of modernity and efficiency. Inside, passengers settled into their seats, some dozing, others chatting quietly, all blissfully unaware of the impending doom that raced towards them at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, on a parallel track, a Conrail freight train lumbered forward, its massive frame a stark contrast to the streamlined passenger train. In the cab of this behemoth, a sinister darkness had taken root. The crew, their senses dulled and judgment clouded by a cocktail of illicit substances, were oblivious to the red flags frantically waving in their faces. As the minute hand ticked closer to the moment of impact, an eerie calm settled over the scene. It was as if nature itself held its breath, anticipating the catastrophe about to unfold. The passengers of the Colonial went about their business, some perhaps feeling an inexplicable sense of unease, a premonition of the horror to come. Then, in a heart-stopping instant, the world erupted into chaos. The screech of metal against metal pierced the air as the 2 trains collided head-on, their massive bodies crumpling like tin cans under the immense force. The sound was deafening, a banshee's wail that echoed across the Maryland countryside, heralding the arrival of death and destruction. The impact was catastrophic. The Colonial's lead engine was thrown skyward, its silver body twisting and contorting in ways metal should never move. Cars buckled and folded, their once sturdy frames now grotesque sculptures of twisted steel. Glass shattered, raining down on the screaming passengers like a deadly hailstorm. But the horror was far from over. As if spawned from the depths of hell itself, flames erupted from the wreckage. The fire spread with terrifying speed, feeding on spilled fuel and debris. The inferno transformed the crash site into a vision of the underworld, the heat so intense it melted the very rails beneath the mangled trains. Inside the wreckage, a nightmare unfolded. Passengers, moments ago peacefully enjoying their journey, now found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered glass. The lucky ones were merely stunned, able to stumble their way to safety through the smoke and flames. Others were not so fortunate. The screams of the injured and dying mingled with the roar of the flames, creating a hellish symphony that would haunt survivors for years to come. Good Samaritans and first responders rushed to the scene, their faces pale with shock as they confronted the full scale of the disaster. They worked tirelessly, pulling survivors from the wreckage, each rescue a small victory against the encroaching flames. As news of the tragedy spread, the nation watched in horror. The death toll climbed steadily, eventually reaching 16 souls lost to the inferno. A further 164 people were injured, their bodies and minds forever scarred by the events of that fateful day. Families were torn apart, lives irrevocably altered in the span of a few terrifying moments. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared and the flames were finally extinguished, investigators descended upon Chase like carrion birds. They picked through the twisted wreckage, seeking answers to the questions that burned in everyone's minds. How could this have happened? Who was to blame for this unthinkable tragedy? The truth, when it emerged, was as shocking as it was infuriating. The crew of the Conrail freight train, those entrusted with the safe operation of their massive vehicle, had been impaired by drugs. Their senses dulled, their reaction time slowed, they had failed to heed the warning signals that should have prevented this catastrophe. The horror of the realization sent shockwaves through the nation. 16 lives snuffed out, 164 others forever changed, all because of a few individuals' reckless disregard for their responsibilities. The anger was palpable, a living thing that threatened to consume those responsible. But beneath the anger lay a deep, gnawing fear. If this could happen once, what was to prevent it from happening again? The Chase collision exposed the vulnerabilities in America's railway system, laying bare the potential for human error to result in unimaginable tragedy. In the years that followed, the ghosts of Chase, Maryland, would continue to haunt the collective consciousness of the nation. The twisted wreckage became a grim monument to the fragility of human life and the terrible consequences of negligence. Safety protocols were overhauled, drug testing became more rigorous, but nothing could erase the memory of that horrific day. For the survivors and the families of those lost, the trauma lingered like a malevolent spirit. Many reported nightmares of screeching metal and consuming flames, waking in cold sweats to the phantom sounds of screams. Some could never bring themselves to board a train again, the mere sight of railroad tracks enough to trigger panic attacks. The town of Chase itself seemed to carry the weight of the tragedy. The site of the collision became a place of pilgrimage for some, a spot to be avoided at all costs for others. Local legends sprouted up, tales of ghostly figures wandering the tracks on dark nights, the echoes of that fateful day refusing to fade into history. As time marched on, the physical scars began to heal. The wreckage was cleared, the tracks repaired, and trains once again thundered through Chase. But beneath the surface, the psychological wounds remained raw and tender. The Chase collision had become more than just a tragic accident. It was a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of the potential consequences of human fallibility. In the annals of American railway history, January 4, 1987, stands as a day of infamy. The collision in Chase, Maryland, serves as a grim milestone, a turning point that forced a nation to confront the dangers lurking on its railways. It's a story of tragedy and loss, of human error and terrible consequences, a horror story written not in fiction, but in the blood and tears of real people. As we look back on that fateful day, we're reminded of the importance of vigilance, the heavy responsibility that comes with operating these massive machines. The ghosts of Chase continue to whisper their warnings, a chilling reminder that on the rails, the line between safety and catastrophe can be terrifyingly thin.
In the sweltering heat of July 28, 1987, New York City pulsed with its usual frenetic energy. The subway system, the city's lifeblood, churned beneath the streets, carrying millions of souls through its labyrinthine tunnels. But on this day, the rhythmic rumble of trains would give way to the screech of twisted metal and the screams of the trapped and injured. As the clock ticked towards disaster, two trains snaked their way through the South Bronx. One stood motionless, obediently halted at a red signal. The other barreled forward, its operator's eyes heavy with exhaustion, his mind clouded by the monotony of the tunnels. Neither the passengers nor the dozing operator knew that in mere moments, their worlds would collide in a catastrophic dance of steel and sparks. The station platform stood eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the impending chaos. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with malevolent glee. In the distance, the faint rumble of an approaching train grew louder, its tempo increasing to a fever pitch. Suddenly, with a bone-chilling screech, the moving train slammed into the stationary one. The impact was devastating, the sound of crumpling metal echoing through the tunnels like the roar of an enraged beast. Sparks flew as the trains ground against each other, illuminating the scene in brief, terrifying flashes. The first car of the moving train crumpled like a tin can, its windows shattering into a deadly spray of glass. Passengers were thrown from their seats, bodies colliding in a horrific tangle of limbs and screams. The second car jackknifed, its metal frame twisting at an impossible angle. The third car, unable to stop its forward momentum, blowed into the wreckage, compounding the destruction. In an instant, the ordinary commute had transformed into a living nightmare. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning rubber and the metallic tang of blood. Smoke began to billow through the carriages, turning the confined space into a suffocating hell. Panicked cries and agonized moans echoed off the tunnel walls, a hellish chorus that seemed to go on forever. Above ground, the city remained blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding beneath its feet. But as the first reports trickled in, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. Emergency services scrambled into action, sirens wailing as they raced towards the scene. The South Bronx, usually bustling with life, fell into an eerie hush, broken only by the approach of ambulances and fire trucks. Deep in the tunnels, survivors stumbled through the wreckage in a daze. Those who could move helped others, their faces pale with shock and streaked with blood and grime. The more severely injured lay trapped, their cries for help growing weaker as the minutes ticked by. In one car, a young woman cradled the lifeless body of a stranger, her eyes wide with disbelief at the sudden intrusion of death into her everyday life. Rescue workers descended into the chaos, their flashlights cutting through the smoke like knives. They moved with urgent precision, triaging the injured and extracting those they could reach. But for every person they saved, another remained tantalizingly out of reach, pinned beneath twisted metal or trapped in rapidly shrinking air pockets. As news of the crash spread, the city held its collective breath. Families of regular commuters frantically tried to reach their loved ones, fear gnawing at their hearts with each unanswered call. At hospitals across the Bronx, staff prepared for an influx of injured, their faces grim as they readied trauma rooms and operating theaters. Hours ticked by, each moment an eternity for those trapped in the wreckage and those waiting for news. The rescue operation continued tirelessly, the rescuers pushing through exhaustion and horror to save as many lives as possible. But despite their heroic efforts, they couldn't save everyone. In the end, one life was lost, a stark reminder of the fragility of human existence in the face of such catastrophic events. The final toll was devastating, 1 dead, 135 injured. The physical wounds would heal in time, but the psychological scars would linger far longer. Survivors spoke of nightmares filled with screeching metal and suffocating darkness. Many found themselves unable to enter the subway again, the once familiar tunnels now tainted with the memory of that horrific day. As the dust settled and the immediate crisis passed, questions began to surface. How could this have happened? Who was responsible for this tragedy? The answer, when it came, was as simple as it was terrifying. The train operator had fallen asleep at the controls, missing a crucial red signal. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city. The idea that a single moment of human weakness could lead to such devastation was almost too much to bear. Investigations were launched, probing deep into the practices of the New York subway system. The spotlight fell on operator fatigue and safety protocols, exposing systemic issues that had long been lurking in the shadows. For the subway operators, the crash was a grim wake-up call. Many spoke of the grueling schedules and relentless pressure that had become the norm. They described fighting against exhaustion on late-night shifts, the monotony of the tunnels lulling them into a dangerous state of semi-consciousness. The crash forced a confrontation with these harsh realities, sparking debates about work conditions and the true cost of keeping the city's lifeblood flowing. In the months and years that followed, changes were implemented. New safety measures were put in place, work schedules were scrutinized, and technology was developed to prevent similar tragedies. But for those who lived through that day in July 1987, no amount of reform could erase the memory of the terror they had experienced. The New York subway system, once a symbol of the city's restless energy and indomitable spirit, now carried with it a shadow of that tragic day. Each time a train screeched to a halt or the lights flickered in a tunnel, passengers felt a fleeting echo of the horror that had unfolded in the South Bronx. Yet, in true New York fashion, the city refused to be cowed by tragedy. The subway continued to run, carrying millions of passengers each day. But now, there was a newfound respect for the complex system that pulsed beneath the city streets, and a keen awareness of the fine line between routine and catastrophe. The crash of July 28, 1987, stands as a chilling reminder of the potential for disaster that lurks beneath the surface of our daily lives. It's a tale of human frailty and the terrible consequences of a single moment's lapse. But it's also a story of resilience, of a city coming together in the face of tragedy, and of the enduring human spirit that refuses to be broken, even in the darkest of tunnels. As the trains continue to rumble through the tunnels of New York, the ghosts of that fateful day in 1987 serve as silent sentinels, a constant reminder of the need for vigilance in the face of routine, and the heavy responsibility borne by those who keep the city's heart beating.
As the clock struck midnight on February 16, 1987, a chill wind howled through the streets of Baltimore, carrying with it the whispers of an impending tragedy. Beneath the city's feet, in the labyrinthine tunnels that snaked through the earth, the stage was set for a nightmare that would haunt the memories of those involved for decades to come. The Amtrak train, a sleek silver serpent, glided smoothly along the tracks from Washington, D.C., its final destination the bustling city of Boston. Inside, passengers settled into their seats, some dozing off to the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails, others gazing absently out of windows that reflected only their own tired faces against the inky blackness beyond. Little did they know that with each passing second, they were hurtling towards a rendezvous with disaster. Deep in the heart of Baltimore, in a tunnel that would soon become a tomb of twisted metal and shattered dreams, a deadly trap lay in wait. The switch, that crucial piece of track that guides massive trains from one line to another, stood silently in the darkness. Its misalignment was imperceptible to the naked eye, a minuscule deviation that would spell the difference between life and death. Like a crooked tooth in an otherwise perfect smile, it waited to bite. As the train approached Baltimore, the city above remained blissfully unaware of the drama about to unfold beneath its streets. In homes and apartments, people slept soundly in their beds or went about their late-night routines, never suspecting that just beneath their feet, fate was about to deal a cruel hand. The train entered the tunnel, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. The engineer, alert at his controls, had no inkling of the danger that lay ahead. The passengers, lulled into a false sense of security by the familiar motions of train travel, were equally oblivious. Then, in a heart-stopping instant, everything changed. The train hit the misaligned switch at full speed. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of screeching metal and shattering glass that echoed through the tunnel like the roar of an enraged beast. The front of the train lurched violently, its wheels leaving the tracks in a spray of sparks that illuminated the tunnel in a hellish orange glow. Inside the cars, chaos erupted. Passengers were thrown from their seats, bodies colliding in a horrific tangle of limbs and screams. Luggage rained down from overhead compartments, becoming deadly projectiles in the confined space. The lights flickered and died, plunging the scene into darkness broken only by the occasional spark from the grinding metal outside. But the worst was yet to come. As the train continued its deadly dance off the tracks, one of the cars began to tilt. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, it rolled onto its side. The screech of metal against concrete filled the air as the car scraped along the tunnel wall, showering the interior with a deadly hail of sparks and debris. In that overturned car, a nightmare unfolded. Passengers who moments ago had been peacefully reading or napping now found themselves in a world turned literally upside down. They scrambled in the darkness, trying to orient themselves in a space that no longer made sense. Some were pinned by seats that had come loose, others trapped beneath the weight of fellow passengers or fallen luggage. The air grew thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning rubber and hot metal. In the pitch blackness of the tunnel, with the sounds of screaming and twisting metal all around, it was as if the gates of hell had opened beneath the streets of Baltimore. Above ground, the first indications of trouble came as a series of muffled booms that shook the foundations of nearby buildings. Emergency services, initially confused by reports of an earthquake, soon realized the horrifying truth. As sirens began to wail across the city, rescue workers raced towards the scene, knowing that every second could mean the difference between life and death. Inside the tunnel, survivors began to emerge from the shock of the initial impact. Those who could move began to help others, their actions guided more by touch and sound than sight in the near-total darkness. Cries for help echoed off the tunnel walls, creating a disorienting cacophony that made it difficult for rescuers to locate victims. The rescue operation was a nightmare of logistics. The narrow confines of the tunnel made it difficult to bring in heavy equipment, forcing many rescuers to work by hand, painstakingly clearing debris and freeing trapped passengers. The darkness and choking dust added to the challenge, turning the rescue into a race against time as the air grew increasingly toxic. Hours ticked by, each moment an eternity for those trapped in the wreckage and those waiting for news. Families of passengers, alerted to the disaster, gathered at hospitals and emergency centers, their faces etched with worry as they waited for word of their loved ones. As dawn broke over Baltimore, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. One life had been lost, snuffed out in that dark tunnel beneath the city streets. Over 20 others were injured, their bodies and spirits battered by the ordeal. The survivors emerged from the tunnel like ghosts, their faces pale and shocked, clothes torn and dirty, bearing the invisible scars of trauma that would haunt them for years to come. In the harsh light of day, investigators descended upon the scene, picking through the twisted wreckage for clues. Their findings would send shockwaves through the rail industry and beyond. The switch, that small piece of track that had caused such devastation, had not been properly maintained or inspected. A tiny oversight, a moment of negligence, had led to a cascade of events that ended in tragedy. The revelation sparked outrage and soul-searching in equal measure. How could such a critical piece of infrastructure have been overlooked? Who was responsible for this lapse in safety? The questions multiplied, each answer revealing new layers of systemic failures and human error. For the survivors, the physical wounds would heal in time, but the psychological scars ran deep. Many reported nightmares of being trapped in dark, confined spaces, the sound of screeching metal forever echoing in their minds. Some could never bring themselves to enter a tunnel again, the mere thought sending them into panic attacks. The city of Baltimore, too, was forever changed. The tunnel, once a mundane part of the city's infrastructure, now stood as a grim monument to the fragility of human life and the terrible consequences of negligence. Urban legends began to circulate, tales of ghostly sounds emanating from the tunnel on quiet nights, the echoes of that fateful journey replaying in an endless loop. In the months and years that followed, changes were implemented across the rail network. Inspection protocols were tightened, maintenance schedules scrutinized, and new technologies developed to prevent similar tragedies. But for those who lived through that terrifying night in February 1987, no amount of reform could erase the memory of the horror they had experienced. The Baltimore Amtrak derailment stands as a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that lurk beneath the surface of our everyday lives. It's a tale of how the smallest oversight can lead to the gravest consequences, a stark warning of the responsibility we bear to maintain the complex systems that keep our world running. As trains continue to thunder through the tunnels of Baltimore and beyond, the ghosts of that fateful night in 1987 serve as silent sentinels, a constant reminder of the need for vigilance in the face of routine, and the heavy price of complacency. For in the dark depths beneath our feet, where steel meets earth and human ingenuity grapples with the forces of nature, the line between safety and catastrophe can be as thin and fragile as a single, misaligned switch.
As September 1987 cast its long shadows over New York City, the subway system pulsed with its usual frenetic energy. But beneath the surface of routine commutes and bustling platforms, a sinister undercurrent of tension was building, ready to erupt into a nightmare that would shake the city to its core. The day began like any other in the Big Apple. Millions of New Yorkers descended into the labyrinthine subway system, a sprawling underground world of fluorescent lights, graffiti-covered walls, and the ever-present rumble of trains. Little did they know that on this day, one of those trains would become the stage for a horror that would haunt the city for years to come. As the sun began to set, casting an eerie orange glow through the grime-covered subway windows, the rush-hour crowd packed into a train bound for the heart of Manhattan. The car was a microcosm of New York itself, a melting pot of humanity crammed into a metal tube hurtling through the darkness. Businessmen in rumpled suits stood shoulder to shoulder with students, tourists, and blue-collar workers heading home after a long day. The air was thick with the mingled scents of sweat, perfume, and the musty odor that permeated the entire subway system. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the faces of the passengers. The noise was a cacophony of squealing wheels, muffled conversations, and the tinny sound of music leaking from a dozen different headphones. At first, no one noticed anything amiss. In a city where personal space was a luxury and tense encounters were a daily occurrence, the initial signs of trouble were lost in the background noise of urban life. But as the train lurched between stations, the atmosphere began to shift subtly, like a pressure drop before a storm. It started with raised voices, barely audible above the clatter of the train. Two men, strangers to each other just moments before, were locked in a heated exchange. Their words were lost in the noise, but the tension in their body language was unmistakable. Other passengers began to take notice, shooting nervous glances in their direction. Some edged away, creating a small bubble of space around the brewing confrontation. As the argument escalated, the air in the subway car grew thick with tension. The other passengers, packed tightly together, found themselves unwilling witnesses to the unfolding drama. Some stared resolutely at their feet or phones, desperately trying to ignore the situation. Others watched with a mix of morbid fascination and growing alarm. Then, in a heart-stopping instant, the situation exploded into violence. One of the men, his face contorted with rage, lashed out. The flash of metal caught the flickering fluorescent light, a knife, pulled from a concealed pocket. Screams erupted as passengers realized the lethal turn the confrontation had taken. In the confined space of the subway car, panic spread like wildfire. People pushed and shoved, desperate to get away from the violence unfolding before them. But there was nowhere to go. The train, oblivious to the horror inside, continued its relentless journey through the dark tunnels. The victim's cry of pain cut through the chaos, a sound that would haunt the witnesses for years to come. Blood, shockingly bright under the harsh lighting, spattered across the floor and nearby passengers. The attacker, caught up in a frenzy of violence, struck again and again, each blow sending fresh waves of terror through the trapped crowd. In those terrifying moments, the familiar confines of the subway car transformed into a nightmarish prison. The windows, usually portals to the outside world, reflected only the horrified faces of the passengers, trapped with a killer in their midst. The doors, normally a promise of escape, remained stubbornly closed as the train hurtled between stations. Brave individuals tried to intervene, risking their own lives to stop the brutal attack. Their shouts and attempts to restrain the attacker added to the cacophony of terror. But in the cramped, chaotic environment, their efforts seemed futile. After what seemed like an eternity, but was in reality only a few minutes, the train screeched into the next station. As the doors slid open, a flood of terrified passengers spilled onto the platform, their screams and cries for help echoing through the station. The attacker, perhaps realizing the gravity of his actions, took advantage of the chaos to slip away into the crowd. Left behind in the blood-spattered car was the victim, his life ebbing away on the cold metal floor. Fellow passengers, some in shock, others moving with desperate purpose, tried to render aid. But for all their efforts, it was clear that a life had been brutally cut short in this most mundane of settings. As news of the attack spread, it sent shockwaves through the city. New York, already grappling with a reputation for crime and violence, now faced the stark reality that even its most essential public spaces were not safe. The subway, once a symbol of the city's connectivity and pulse, now stood as a reminder of its darkest potential. In the days and weeks that followed, the incident became more than just a crime statistic. It was a turning point, a moment that crystallized the fears and frustrations of millions of New Yorkers. The subway stabbing became a rallying cry for those demanding better security and a crackdown on crime. The police investigation that followed was intense. Detectives combed through security footage, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and plastered the city with wanted posters. But in a city of millions, with a subway system that saw billions of rides each year, finding one man proved to be a daunting task. For the witnesses, the trauma of that day lingered long after the physical wounds had healed. Many reported nightmares of being trapped in blood-soaked subway cars, unable to escape. Some could no longer bring themselves to ride the subway, their daily commutes becoming exercises in anxiety and fear. The incident sparked heated debates about public safety, racial profiling, and the socio-economic factors that contributed to urban crime. Politicians seized on the tragedy, promising tougher laws and increased police presence. Civil rights activists warned against knee-jerk reactions that could lead to discrimination. In response to the public outcry, changes were implemented across the subway system. More police officers were deployed to patrol trains and stations. new security measures were introduced, from improved lighting to emergency communication systems. But for many New Yorkers, the sense of vulnerability lingered. The subway stabbing of September 1987 became a dark chapter in New York City's history, a moment when the everyday horror of urban crime burst into the public consciousness in the most visceral way possible. It was a reminder of the fragility of public order and the potential for violence that lurked just beneath the surface of city life. Years later, the incident remains etched in the collective memory of the city. For those who lived through it, whether as direct witnesses or as part of the broader New York community, it marked a loss of innocence. The subway, once merely a means of transportation, became a symbol of urban anxiety, a daily reminder of the potential for random violence. Yet, in true New York fashion, the city refused to be cowed by fear. Millions of people continued to ride the subway every day, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the necessity of urban life. But they rode with a new awareness, a heightened vigilance born from the knowledge that in the confined spaces beneath the city streets, horror could strike at any moment. The New York subway stabbing of 1987 stands as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary places, and the profound impact a single act of violence can have on a city's psyche. It's a tale of urban horror, where the monsters are all too human and the setting is the backdrop of daily life. In the annals of New York City's history, it remains a stark testament to the city's struggles with crime and the ongoing challenge of maintaining safety in one of the world's most complex urban environments.
As the dust settles on these four catastrophic events of 1987, we're left to reflect on the lives lost and the lessons learned. These tragedies reshaped railway safety protocols, ensuring that such incidents would become increasingly rare. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sinister Media for more deep dives into history's darkest moments. Until next time, stay safe and remember, the past holds valuable lessons for our future.